Hi there, and welcome to this Mad Sense video in which I want to share some what the bleep suggestions for how we should be going about researching this phenomenon. So in part one on the phenomenology, I showed you the kind of many ways in which this phenomenon is able to intrude by invasively presenting information into the aware mind. In part two, I showed you how difficult it was to ignore because it gains significance in your life and steals mind share, making it very, very difficult to ignore. So in this video, what I'd like to do is just summarize that complexity and point out how all of those things actually happen together in a strategic and tactical way. And then point out that actually, part of our problem is that people who don't hear voices, so people who don't actually share this experience, can't imagine that this is even possible, really. The way that this phenomenon presents, all these different varieties of intruding in the mind. And of course, voice hearers are generally seen as confused and as mentally ill and tend to be dismissed. So I hope to kind of change that perception with this piece up here on the complexity of the phenomenon by making it simpler. And then number two is to pick out kind of the one thing that is common to all of these varieties, because I think that is the thing that we actually that we really need to be focusing on. And then I'll pick out one or 2 points at the end just to summarize the video. So one of the things that I find in a lot of the phenomenological studies is that what we tend to be doing is we kind of tend to be separating out the bits and pieces of it. We're kind of focusing on the auditory piece, or mostly the auditory verbal piece, and then are kind of looking at auditory verbal pathways in the brain. We're kind of comparing it to, say, inner speech and all of these kinds of things. And for me, I think we're actually missing the point, because this jack in the box, as you know, this is how I like to represent it, is actually much, much more than that. It's all of these auditory and auditory verbal stimuli. So, so I'm experiencing all of these, pretty much simultaneously, whilst my brain is actually still working fine, I was going to say in the background. I should probably say in the foreground. I sometimes wonder which one is in the foreground and which one is in the background. So, as I pointed out in phenomenology part one, there is this kind of range of auditory and auditory verbal modes of communication between the voice hearer and this strange phenomenon. The most invasive of them being this two-way communication, which is at the level of thought, where, say, I hear voices and my own thoughts as the thought echo kind of in the same bandwidth. And I say perhaps the label hearing voices is not a good descriptor of that phenomenology, but recognize that actually that is sort of one. This is the piece that we kind of tend to be focusing on the most, because this is the piece that people find most distressing, because language is how we understand things. And of course, this is actually interfering, right at the level of thought. So this is obviously very, very distressing. So that's the piece that we're focusing on. And my voices, of course, also though are imposing, all these other sensations. So the body sensations, the time, the tempo, these visions, even sensations of temperature. So all of these things, and of course, let's see. In my case, I find my voices use this for me kind of in sort of two ways. The one is to actually impose consequences, so they use this to kind of become more aggressive and to, sort of gain attention. And for me, sort of almost as sort of punctuation. I don't know how to put it. It's a way of sort of adding highlights, if you like, to the story that they're actually trying to impose at the same time. But what we have to recognize is that this is happening at the same time as this is. The other one, I say the one that tends to add confusion, to understanding this phenomenon, is the idea of sort of thought intrusion, thought withdrawal, thought insertion, which kind of mimics thought in a way. So this is the one that I mentioned is the easiest to confuse with sort of normal stimuli. As I say, except for me, that what's very, very obvious about it is that it has a very, very definite boundary and intrudes in the aware mind. Because if it didn't intrude in the aware mind, we simply wouldn't be aware of it. We wouldn't pay attention to it. We wouldn't even know actually that it was there. So that, of course, is still the key thing. The key thing about it. But I still find that my voices are actually able to do both of these at the same time. This will happen, and then my voices will actually, sort of comment on it. And in fact, I mean, even literally, even simultaneously. In that sense, this is a little bit more, like this one, because voices will be inserting all these little pricks and prods, say in my joints, along with this kind of story about how they're kind of, refitting me or outfitting me for something or other. I mean, it's this little story that's, that goes with it. So that's how voices are actually combining, say, these sort of somatic things, with the verbal. And then, of course, as I mentioned in, I think, the second video, is that my voices have literally put on these displays of phenomenology just to impress me or something. Really kind of annoying stuff. I mentioned the story of the sort of fairies, which went on for months. It was in the sort of evening when I was going to bed, and in fact, that's what that was about. It was about disturbing my sleep. And then, of course, I kind of showed you sort of one other example of how they bring many sort of phenomenological features together in a story by declaring that I am the second coming. So, regardless of my belief, the fact that I don't believe in the second coming, I'm not a fan of the revealed religions for obvious reasons. My voice has kind of declared or introduced the idea that I was the second coming, then declared that I was. I went along for a year just batting it back and kind of saying, I'm not the second coming, I'm not the second coming. And eventually, after a year, I got tired of that response and tried something different and said, okay, I'll be the second coming. And I started to call myself Pope Greggy Boy, actually, because I decided I liked the idea of being infallible. But which just became the sort of game, that went, that voices and I sort of played along. And of course, this is when they were sort of God and the devil and an evil God, and then just a big man, as I sort of pushed back on their assertions of what they are. And really, what I'm getting at here is that actually, regardless of whether or not I believe these things, voices were able to impose this experience on me. So the fact, when I was sort of saying to them, I'm not the second coming, they were aggressive in kind of saying, you are, whether you like it or not, we're co-opting you into this role. It's a way for them to kind of have a say in what I'm doing and to claim my ideas as theirs. And then, of course, when I sort of went the other way around and said, okay, I'll play the role of being the second coming, of course, that was the way for them to encourage me, and it led to all sorts of mania and all of these other kinds of things. The point that I'm getting at is that actually our beliefs about this are actually completely irrelevant in terms of understanding what this phenomenology is. The key thing about it is that it presents stimuli. Excuse me. It presents stimuli into our processor, which I've represented using this beforehand. So we have this. A stimulus is evaluated in a context of what we expect. It produces a reaction in the body. So this is literally a body reaction, the brain recognizing the stimulus. And if you like, our mind, which to me is still part of the brain, but this is our aware mind. This is now, the piece that we're aware of, and where we have some, executive function can actually act, now taking over to process this information in a deliberate way to achieve some kind of outcome or interpretation. And these stimuli are arriving in competition with my sort of ordinary stimuli during the day. So this is what we have to recognize about this thing. This is the one thing to focus on, is all of this stuff, all this variety of weird and wonderful special effects, as I call them, is being presented in pretty much in one place, for want of another description. In our processor. And the reason I'm saying this in our processor is that it's actually engaging the mind, it's engaging our processor, it's engaging the body, which is producing an actual a reaction. And all of this is happening simultaneously. So I've got all these varieties, number one, that are happening together in a strategic and tactical way. Number one. It's how voices are presenting it. Number two, while that is happening, I'm still, getting stimuli from my environment, and my brain is actually processing them in an ordinary way. Now, of course, sometimes this is it engages especially, for example, when it engages your threat system, or in fact, any time I say that it's getting your attention, that's when it's coming into the foreground and my day-to-day stuff is going on in the background. But it's that kind of shift between, my focus on real-world stimuli and stimuli from this thing is just which one is more, doing a better job of getting my attention at the time. So they're both sort of, are being, both my ordinary stimuli, and stimuli from this thing are coming into the same processor. And I say they're competing with each other. And sometimes one is a little bit more dominant, if you like, than the other in terms of the mind share that it's actually gaining. Okay, so the one thing that we need to be focusing on is that there is a phenomenon. It exists. Okay, and there's 300 million of us experiencing this right now, and we see many interpretations of it over millennia. It's been messing with mankind or humankind for a very long time. It's presenting information into the aware mind, okay, at a point in parallel to ordinary everyday stimuli. So this stuff, all this variety is a way of sort of gaining our attention and gaining, and sort of holding mind share, stealing mind share. Okay, the one thing that's common to all of these is that they're present in the aware mind in this way that is noticeably different than ordinary stimuli. So that's the thing that researchers need to be focusing on. All this complexity is getting in the way of us actually understanding what this phenomenon is. So I'm going to present this again in a slightly different visual view, but it's the same story. And of course, I want to just again sort of focus on stories, and the stories, if you like, that we sort of tell about this, because this is why this is actually so important to us. So this is the sort of my story model that I use, and all I'm doing with this is I'm connecting activity, mind, and story. This is just the body, mind, world connection. I'm simply saying that actually we are ordinarily, our stimuli come from our activity, our body, for example. So sometimes, say we need to pee, for example, the body will send a signal, it comes into the aware mind, at a point when, when the bladder reaches a threshold of fullness. There's activity, so the stuff that we're doing produces stimuli. There's the mind itself, which is producing stimulus as I'm thinking. I'm either taken care of, I'm enjoying, or I'm conceiving. I'm representing the aware mind with this window, because this is really my window into the world. And actually, the brain is presenting information into this window. And of course, what we're doing is we're taking stimuli from our environment, we're combining it with our history, so our memories and our memes, our programs, and of course, we're combining those, in a way, that we project forward. So this is actually, what we're going to do with it. So, we're either translating that to activity, or we're interpreting it in some way in terms of our story. So what's happening again here, of course, is that this Jack in the Box has imposed on, not just the story of individuals, but on our story as humankind, by imposing this, concept of the world on us. Whether or not you believe, in the revealed religions, for example, they're a fact of our lives and our story, that for me actually just gets in the way of how we get along with each other. So this is why this is actually so important, but it is this story component that we talk about here, because this is our interpretation of it. And what I'm saying is we have to put this aside. We have to recognize that actually, in terms of understanding this phenomenon, this is irrelevant. What we need to be focusing on, again, is this little thing down here, which is how this Jack in the Box is actually inserting itself into the aware mind. Okay, so it's arriving with all those weird and wonderful characteristics of the previous slide in our window into the world. And so this is the other important point, is that there is a mechanism by which our brain actually presents two frames of reference for comparison. That's how we form actually form a perception. And this is actually, this is where Jack is intruding. And I'll talk a bit more about that in another video actually, where I talk about the brain and in fact the process that was on the previous slide. But this is what we need to be focusing on: is how does this phenomenon intrude into our window into the world? So when I say the window into the world, the aware mind is collecting information, as I say, from our body, from our activity, which is again really sort of body-based, if you like, from our mind, so our history and our and of course what we're trying to achieve, which is how we're sort of projecting it forward. And this is what I'm saying. Our brain is actually presenting these two perceptions. It's kind of where I am, where I'm trying to go, and those are the two frames of reference that our aware mind is sort of, in which our aware mind is exchanging information to form a sort of both a perception of the world, which is this piece down here, which is based on where I'm at, and a concept of the world, which is the kind of projection of that going forwards. So again, bringing it back to this, just to show it visually in a different way, this thing is actually one phenomenon that presents in many, many ways, as described on this, on the previous slide. Those many, many, many ways are a ruse. They're the piece that add the confusion and the complexity. And when you see it, to say in this format, where it's just represented by one icon, we need to and see this thing intruding in the aware mind. This is what researchers need to be focusing on. So the key thing again to take away from that is that we need to be recognizing that this entity is sentient. It actually is, has the characteristics of, well, we attribute human-like characteristics to it because it is sentient, because it's presenting this stuff strategically and tactically. More than that, is presenting it in a way that is actually confusing and complicated to avoid us discovering what it is. And so, which is, and of course, that's what's happening, is we cannot conceive of an answer to the why question. Why would some entity perpetrate crimes against humanity on this scale? Okay, so this thing has been pestering us, to put it mildly, for millennia. There are, say, roughly 300 million people today that are actually, distressed, by hearing voices enough to be a serious knock on their quality of life. It's become a huge problem for us when we've accepted what voices have claimed to be, and when we have actually acted on it. And of course, the consequences of that are embedded in our society. And of course, we've formed lots of interpretations about that and beliefs about that. And of course, those beliefs are embedded, in the way we live for many of us. What I again want to point out actually is that that stuff is actually covering, if you like, what this phenomenon actually is. Our beliefs are getting in the way of us studying it properly. What we need to be doing is setting those things aside. We need to recognize that actually understanding the idea of why some phenomenon would be imposing this awful outcome on us is not an answer I can actually conceive of. I mean, I've only come up with one, which I'll share with you in a moment. But what we can do is we can observe we can certainly observe what is happening. And of course, that is the point of this particular video. Is the previous two slides just kind of showing that actually all that variety and complexity is the sort of cover up, if you like. The piece we need to be focusing on is how it's arriving in the aware mind. And then presumably we need to be asking the question, okay, we can see this thing, we know it's there. We may not have been able to identify it yet, say on an image in somebody's brain, but we might if we, with this kind of information. And then for me, the sort of process from there, in terms of figuring out what it is actually, starts with very simply asking the question: is it human or is it not human? If it's human, then actually, then it's been with us for a very long, very long time. Then there's, then I would, if it's human, then there presumably is some kind of connection for us, between us. and a handful of people are somehow abusing that. I can't really conceive of that. And if it's not human, okay, then this is some kind of energy parasite, most likely. The Mayans used to call this an energy parasite. The sort of first people nations of North America and Hawaii talk of Wetiko, W-E-T-I-K-O. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. I mean, the only thing I can imagine is this whole idea of some sort of energy siphon, because for me, what's happening is voices are interfering with my natural mind processing, which flows when things are sort of going well, and what this phenomenon is doing is disrupting that flow. And of course, there is chemistry supporting that flow, and when you disrupt it, something is changing there, and it's certainly changing my energy. So the whole idea of the sort of Mayans calling this sort of thing an energy parasite may have some sort of merit. Having said that, I have to add, of course, that I'm actually not qualified to answer the question of what it is. What I'm trying to do here is point to the fact that actually, if ever there was a reason for every country on the planet to cooperate, this is it. This thing represents a global problem that we have been struggling with for millennia. And if I was to ask somebody to look at this, I would be looking for a quantum physicist who understands the mind brain. I would think that for me would be the most likely candidate to have good ideas about what this phenomenon actually is, so that we can do something about eliminating its effects on us. So I hope this doesn't sound a little too crazy. I think I'm entitled to one or two crazy suggestions, seeing as voices have provoked me for 10 years. So thank you for listening. And once again, I'm trying to keep as much of this as possible free for people who hear voices. To do that, I've got a fundraiser on crowdrise.com called Someone You Know Hears Voices. There are other organizations, kind of working in the space who would actually, welcome support. And of course, since I'm talking phenomenology, the most interesting one, of course, would be the International Consortium on Hallucination Research, who are researching the phenomenon. So if you think this is interesting and can help, I think those are the people who actually, are doing the work in terms of understanding this phenomenon. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.